Well, let's go ahead and turn your Bibles to John chapter 1. We'll be finishing chapter 1 this morning. We are in the gospel, which is the good news about Jesus Christ, about his death, his burial and resurrection. The structure of the Gospel of John looks like this, and we have covered already the prologue, the first section, and that emphasized the divine and perfect revelation of Jesus, and that he, as God, came down to humanity, and he is the ultimate expression of God's grace and God's truth. And in this prologue, the first section of the book, Jesus was introduced from above. Then we started the second major section, which is the book of signs, and we're coming to a close this morning, the introduction to the narrative, where we're now learning about Jesus as the person, the God come in the flesh. And in that section, Jesus is being introduced from below. And what we've covered so far is John's witness of Jesus. Specifically, John talks us about his own ministry and testimony of who Jesus is. And then we've looked at the first disciples who were introduced to Jesus. And we've been seeing that through this section, this introduction to the narrative, the gospel writer has divided this up into days. And we saw the day 1 and day 2 where it was John's testimony, where he was first on day 1, he was questioned by the priests from Jerusalem about his identity and his ministry of baptism. And then on day 2, we saw that John gave his own testimony to his disciples, revealing Jesus as the Messiah and why that was. And in day 3, last week, we saw that John introduced his 2 disciples to Jesus. That was Andrew, and most likely it was John. And then we had Andrew introduces Simon Peter, to Jesus. And it's unclear from the text, you notice I have it in brackets, it's unclear from the text when that happened. Was that the next day, a few days later? It doesn't tell us. But the important connection was that the 2 disciples met, and then Andrew found his brother and introduced him to Jesus. So that brings us to day 4, where we're going to continue and look at the first disciples, part 2, and my most creative title yet, More Introductions. It's John 1, 43-51. And this morning, we're going to continue and see and look at 2 more introductions. Now, we need to keep in mind that this first section of the gospel, it focuses on a transition from John the Baptist's ministry to Jesus' ministry. But before we get into the text, into the details of the text, I want to look at the whole text and read the entire passage. So let me start here with John chapter 1, verses 43 to the end. The next day, he purposed to go into Galilee, and he found Philip. And Jesus said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, of the city of Andrew and Peter. And Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him, of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." So Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him, and he said to him, said of him, "Behold, an Israelite, indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered and said to him, "Before Philip called you, when you were underneath the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." And Jesus answered and said to him, "Because I said to you that I saw you under a fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see the heavens open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." All right, so let's move to the first introduction. The first introduction is Jesus introduces himself to Philip, verses 43 through 44. And I want to read that text again. It says, the next day he purposed to go into Galilee, and he found Philip, and Jesus said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. So he was with John the Baptist on the other side of the Jordan, the east side, somewhere in the region of Perea, and he is going up into the region of Galilee. Now that gap is about 12 miles, but depending on where he was in Perea and where he's going in Galilee, It would be more than 12 miles. And he is there in Perea still. He is purposing to go. He's about to leave. So before he leaves, he finds Philip. Now the name Philip means a lover of horses, or one who is fond of horses, and that's a Greek name. And it appears that Philip is also a disciple of John the Baptist. He's there, and then Jesus tells him, "Follow me." And this "follow me" is a present command, which means it's a continual thing. It's come, follow me. It's not a mere come accompany me as I go to Galilee, but come become a disciple of me. I will be your teacher, I will be your rabbi, and you will follow me. Not just physically, but learn from my ways, walk in my footsteps, and then when I am gone, you will continue my work, my ministry, my studies, my teaching. That is a common relationship of a rabbi to a student. And that's what it means to be a disciple, one who follows Jesus, one who you can see how following as an idea of a disciple, it makes a perfect word picture. As you follow, disciples typically followed masters or rabbis behind them out of respect for them. And so you can almost see Mama Duck with the little ducklings in a row behind them. But those ducklings would learn everything they needed to know as they followed directly, so that the master's ways would then be imprinted and learned by the disciples. That's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And that is inherent from the start of believing in Jesus. When we believe in him, we become his disciple. We follow in his ways. We learn from him as our teacher. And then we continue his work. Exactly what a disciple would do. Now, typically in the first century, students and parents would decide what teacher to follow. Just like today, you usually decide what school you want to go to, what college or graduate school or so on and so forth. But here, Jesus is breaking that mold, and he's the one that's choosing a disciple. He's telling you come follow me. You be my disciple. Be my student. So already Jesus is emphasizing his sovereignty and his control and in his plan being worked out. Now, earlier, Andrew and supposedly or presumably John, and then Simon Peter were introduced to Jesus. Now, in this context, in contrast, we see Jesus introducing himself to Philip. We see Jesus found him, meaning he was searching for him specifically. And it's very interesting in the distinction here tells us that there are two ways in which people come to follow Jesus. It gives us a model. The first one is where other people introduce you, share Jesus, and introduce you to the Messiah. And you then follow. You make that decision, and you investigate, and you personally choose to follow Christ. Here, the second model is when primarily Jesus calls people directly. Now, in both cases, both are true. If other people are sharing Christ with you and leading you to Christ and you make that decision to follow, well, obviously God's at work calling you. But primarily, or more things that we can see, is that people are sharing the message. But there are times where that's flipped, where Christ is the one drawing people in from their hearts. Now, in this context, it tells us that Philip responds in a positive manner because he follows him. He becomes an apostle. This is an apostle Philip. And then John then adds about Philip in verse 44 that Philip was from Bethsaida, meaning he grew up there. That's the town where he was raised. Bethsaida means house of food for the journey. And the food that would be there, we're referring to, would be fish. It was a big fishing town. Obviously, it's on the eastern side of the Jordan River as it empties into the Sea of Galilee. But it was known for as a fishing town. And today it looks like this. This is the remains of it, of Bethsaida. And you can see this is the Sea of Galilee. Now, in ancient times, the coastline was much closer. But John tells us that this was the city of Andrew and Peter as well. So it suggests that Philip knew them. But since that time, we know that Andrew and Philip have moved to Capernaum. It tells us that in Mark. And Capernaum is here. It's just about 3 miles away, a little less than 3 miles away. Now, when we talk about Philip, we want to make sure we know who we're talking about, because in the Bible there's two different Philips. And this is the Apostle Philip. It's not to be confused with Philip, who was the first appointed deacon in Acts chapter 6. And this is not Philip the evangelist from Acts chapter 8, who evangelized the Ethiopian eunuch. That Philip is someone different. That deacon and evangelist, same person, has 4 daughters, someone different. This is the apostle. And not much is known about his activities after Acts 2. According to a document from the 4th century, it said that Philip went to these different regions. The Parthian Empire, which is in this region, also Ethiopia, which is much further down, and then also Ashdod. It's hard to know how accurate that document is, but that is it as far as Philip. And after Jesus calls Philip as a disciple, then we read about Philip introduces Nathanael to Jesus. It's fascinating that not much is known about Philip at all beyond that. Even in this narrative, Philip almost acts as a connection between Nathanael and Jesus. But he gives us that example of Jesus calling a disciple, and then a disciple follows, and then a disciple shares. So in the next 2 verses, we will see Philip bearing witness of Jesus. He says, Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him, of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." So Philip found Nathanael. Nathanael means gift of God. And he is known in the Synoptic Gospels. When we say Synoptic Gospels, we mean Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as Bartholomew. Bartholomew is a family name. Bar in Hebrew and Aramaic means son of. And Tholomew is actually going to be son of Ptolemy. So that's, like if you're referring to me, I'd be son of Bruce. That'd be my name. But my name is Jason. So same thing here. He's known as Bartholomew, but his name is Nathanael. Once again, not much is known about Nathanael outside of his activities beyond Acts 2. But there is some church evidence that speaks of Bartholomew going to India. And we know in much greater church witness that Thomas went to India. So it's possible that they went together. But it's hard to know for sure. So Philip finds Nathanael and says to him, "We have found him." Notice it says we. Who are the we? The we indicates that there's a bigger group here that's searching for the Messiah and saw it. And that would include John the Baptist and his disciples. So it also includes, and also implies that Nathanael is part of that group. If Nathanael wasn't, he'd be like, "I don't care." Right? But if Nathanael was also searching for the Messiah, this would be a great thing for Philip to come and share and say, "We found him. We got him. We know who it is. Come on." And he would be excited. So Nathanael is also seeking out the coming of the Messiah. And did you notice the repetition in the text, in the word find? We have Andrew finds his brother Simon. We have Jesus finds Philip, and then we have Philip finding Nathanael. In those 3 actions, we see an intentional search of people in order to share information and new relationships. And then both Andrew and Philip declare that they have found the Messiah, indicating that they were searching for the king, someone to follow. And they have finally found what they're looking for. And they share it. This is something that people need, whether they know it or not. This is what the heart longs for and searches for. Jesus is the treasure to be found. So when Philip tells Nathanael that they found the Messiah, he identifies him or describes him as him of whom Moses in the law and also in the prophets wrote. Now what he's referring to here is Deuteronomy 18:18, where Moses writes that God is speaking here, I will raise up a prophet like you, Yahweh is speaking to Moses, from them, the Israelis, from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak to them whatever I command. So from that prophecy, in Jewish history, they've always looked for that second prophet like Moses who would lead the people and speak forth God's words. It's referred to a lot of times as the prophet. And here Nathanael is saying, we found them. We found that one of whom Moses was talking about. And then it says, and also the prophets wrote. Now that could refer to any of the additional prophecies throughout the Old Testament referring to the Messiah concerning his coming and his identity. So by Philip appealing to Nathanael on the basis of the predictions of the law and the prophets, the law and prophets, when they say that, it refers to the whole of the Old Testament. When he appeals to Nathanael on that basis, what does it suggest? It suggests that Nathanael knows these prophecies, knows these promises, these predictions, and thus knows the scriptures, that he is a student of the Bible. And notice how Philip identifies Jesus. He does it in three ways. Number one, he gives his name, Jesus, which means Yahweh saves. In Aramaic or Hebrew, it's Yeshua. We get our name Joshua from it. He also identifies him from his hometown, which is from Nazareth, and then also from his father's name, which is the son of Joseph. Joseph means may Yahweh add. And from the context of its original name in Genesis of Joseph, it's may God add to this blessing. And when Rachel named Joseph that, he was asking God for more children, more sons. Now when it says he's a son of Joseph, this is not to deny the virgin birth, but it gives Jesus' association to which household. Legally, Jesus is Joseph's son. Now Nazareth is here, and it is a small town. Nathanael said to him, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Philip said to him, come and see. Now why would Nathanael say that? Oh, can anything good come out of Nazareth? It implies that mostly bad things come from Nazareth. It's one of those towns that doesn't have a good reputation. The town itself was relatively small. It had anywhere from 600 to 2,000 people in it, the best guess of scholars. It's not mentioned in the Old Testament. It's not mentioned in any contemporary Jewish writings or secular writings. The first place it's in writing is in the New Testament here. And when we think of great men, great leaders, we expect them to come from great cities, well-known cities, not from Nazareth. And in fact, the Messiah is supposed to be born in Bethlehem. So no figure was prophesied as coming from Nazareth. And Nathanael, we'll learn in chapter 2, he came from Cana, which is only about 8 miles away. And when he would make his multiple trips down to Jerusalem, he would probably pass by or have passed by Nazareth. And he would know what kind of city it is, what kind of town it is, and the people there. And he knows that the character of the people is not the best. And we know this as well from Luke chapter 4, when Jesus, after Jesus' baptism, he goes back to his hometown and he reads the prophecy from Isaiah and saying that he's fulfilled it. How does his own hometown people receive him? Those people who are so in love with God, they excommunicate him, they reject him, and they try to throw him off a cliff. It kind of shows the character of the people that he grew up with. It's not good. So Philip answers Nathanael's skepticism by inviting him to meet Jesus. When we share Christ with other people, and they, come on, do I really need Jesus? It's just a crutch. It's just something, a legend that people made up. We need to just say, come and see. Read the script. Read the Gospel of John. Read the text, and let me talk to you next time and answer any questions. And see for yourself. Ask ask him to reveal himself to you through the scriptures. So here we see a pattern. Just as John the Baptist introduces the two, and then Andrew introduces Simon Peter, here we have Philip introducing Nathanael. And after the testimony is shared, then we see Jesus and Nathanael are introduced. And that's the remaining of our text. So Nathanael is looking for the Messiah, and he is a student of the Scriptures, a disciple of John the Baptist. And then we read in 47 that Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him and said to him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." And what high praise of Nathanael in all of this text. Now, it is likely that Jesus had not left the area yet. He's still in Perea, where John the Baptist is baptizing, and he has the disciples around him. Most likely that's the case. And if that's so, then when Jesus says this, there are other people around hearing him say these words. And did you see the twist? Did you see the turn there? Where Nathanael was supposed to be coming and seeing Jesus to investigate him, it's actually Jesus the one who's seeing and has already investigated and already has come to a conclusion about Nathanael and says something very positive. He says there's no deceit in him. Now, the word for deceit there means to take advantage through trickery or underhanded methods, to deceive someone to take advantage of them. When he says, the text says, "Behold, an Israelite truly," that word for truly there in Greek is actually, the word indeed in Greek is truly. So there's a little bit of wordplay there. Truly, there's no deceit. He's doing a play on words, and it's fascinating because what does that imply about the rest of Israel? That they're not as honest as Nathanael is. But this is also a play on words. Jesus is referring back to a text in Genesis. He's referring back to the story of Jacob. Jacob, his name was changed to Israel. And we know from the story where he deceived his father to win a blessing, where he had put on the goat's hair and his brother Esau's clothing. And then he got the blessing, he left, Esau came in, and Isaac said to Esau, "Your brother came deceitfully and has taken away your blessing." Now, in the Greek translation of that text, it uses the same word for deceit. So you can see it probably harkens back to this story in an intertextual play where Jacob, Israel, was forced to leave his home because of deceit. That deceit to steal a blessing to get personal gain, to put himself first. He wasn't living for God. He wasn't living in obedience. And here he's saying Nathanael is different. Nathanael is breaking that mold. He's someone that is honest. He's not saying that he's perfect, morally perfect, but he's an honest man. He treats people with honesty because he loves the Lord. So it speaks of Nathanael's character and honesty, and it witnesses to his later apostleship. It's most likely that these people who are reading the Gospel of John probably know Nathanael. And when Jesus is saying, this guy here, he's honest, when Nathanael gives a testimony, it will help them to believe Nathanael's testimony, his witness, his teaching. Now, Jesus can make this statement about Nathanael because, as we're going to learn in the next chapter, in chapter 2, verse 25, it says, "And because he did not need anyone to testify concerning the man, for he himself knew what was in a man." Now, how? How did Jesus know what was in a man? We're going to answer that in just a little bit. So we'll get back to that question. But before we do move on, we need to note that, look what Jesus' words say about a true Israelite. An Israelite was one who had a covenant relationship with God, one that had faith in God. What did that person look like? He was honest. He was an honest person, a person of integrity. And that translates right over into who we are as Christians. As Christians, we are God's people, people who are in covenant relationship with God. And God expects us also to be people that are characterized by honesty. one who uses their life not to take advantage of people, but to help them, to invest in them as we serve God and bear witness to his name. Okay, so after this incredible announcement, if you were coming up to Jesus and expecting, okay, here's this king, supposedly that they found, and his first words to you were that kind of praise, how would you respond? I think he responds, he's a little uncomfortable, and he says, Nathanael said to him, how do you know me? From where do you know me? The question indicates that they've never met before. And so Jesus answers and said to him, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. Now there's a picture of a fig tree. There are multiple fig trees all over the place in Israel, at least there was. And if you can notice, on a bright sunny day, look at that dense shade. Fig trees were known as a place of shade where you can sit, you can rest, you can meet people. It's associated with personal prayer, meditation on God's word, or reading of God's word, and the teaching of God's word, or a combination of all the above. And so when Jesus says, before Philip came to you, you were underneath the fig tree, and I saw you. What was he doing? It's a big question. What was Nathanael doing there? And ultimately, we don't know, but there's some good suggestions. There's good things in the text that indicate what he was doing. Number one, with the verbal links of deceit and Israelite, it's possible that he was reading the story about Jacob's deceit or meditating on it. It's possible that he didn't have a scroll, Torah scroll. Those are very expensive, and they're out in the wilderness. So it could be that John the Baptist has just taught about that, and now he's meditating on it. From Philip's words, it could be that Nathanael is meditating on the prophecies about the coming Messiah, who he would be, what he would do, and in a combination, he could also be praying. From these following verses, it's very possible that he's praying to God concerning the Messiah, that he would be part of that kingdom and be a person in whom is used by the Messiah. Or some kind of combination. We don't know how long he was underneath the fig tree. But the question indicates that they had never met before that moment. So when does Jesus say that they met? Jesus says, while you were under the fig tree, I saw you. Now he's not talking about visually, because Philip had to go and get him, so he's out of his range of sight. But when Jesus says, I saw you, it's a figure of speech that says that I recognized your prayer or your thoughts or your meditation, and thus I'm responding. It's kind of one of those things where you pray and say, God, give me a sign, and all of a sudden the phone rings. Right? It's one of those divine timing where he was either praying, meditating, reading scriptures about the Messiah, the coming, or all the above, and then Philip comes and say, hey, Nathanael, we found him. We found the Messiah. Come. It's one of those timings. And Jesus is basically saying, I saw you. I saw your heart. I saw your words. I saw your prayer. I saw your actions, and I responded to you. It's kind of like saying when a teacher says, is lecturing and says, okay, I see that hand, and I'll get to you as soon as I finished. Jesus is saying, I recognize you, and then I sent Philip. The point is, no matter what situation was true of that event, the point is that during Nathanael's time alone, he was alone underneath this fig tree. Whether he was praying, meditating on scriptures, reading scriptures, all the above, the point is that he was building a relationship with God. That was a time where Jesus, as God, saw him. And it's that response that Nathanael then answered, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel. That's quite a switch. That's quite a change. The word rabbi, the title, is an honored title. It's given to people who have a higher status, who are known as being respected teachers of God's law, God's word. And then he says, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel. Those are referring to the same thing. Those titles mean the same thing. The Son of God, and the King of Israel is the promised Messiah. He's saying, you are the one we've been looking for. You have the authority of God. When it says the Son of God, that was often used of the kings of Israel, that concept, the metaphor. And it bears the idea that God had a possession of a nation and a people. And just like you have, let's say, all the men have inheritance, have a property, possessions, your son would thus have the authority as your heir of all of those possessions as well. That's basically what it's saying, is a king of Israel would have the authority over God's possessions and his people as a son. But here, thus, the Messiah is also God's son, just like the kings of old were called God's sons because God had granted them the authority. The Son of God here is the King of Israel who has authority over God's possessions. But although Nathanael is saying one thing, as far as you're that promised conquering king, earthly king that we've been looking for, his words are speaking louder than he understands. Because in the title, Son of God and King of Israel, we know post-resurrection there's a lot more to it than he understands. He doesn't just have an authoritative position over God's people, but as a Son of God, he is characteristic of the Father. His life, his person, is filled with love, with righteousness, with holiness, with obedience as a perfect Son. And that title reflects an intimate relationship between a father and a son. And in fact, in this gospel, as we see, Jesus is going to proclaim that relationship reflects his oneness with God, that he is God himself. And that confession of Nathanael, it echoes John the Baptist. His confession, his conclusion, where he says, I myself have seen and have testified that this is the Son of God. Now, because Jesus has identified Nathanael as being an honest man and a true Israelite, what does that imply about his words? Number one, that these titles that he's saying about Jesus, they're true. Right? And then also, every true Israelite, people in that covenant relationship with Yahweh, they also will confess Jesus as the Son of God, as their King. Now, you might say, I don't see the connection. Under a fig tree, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And then now he's to Son of God. Where's the connection? We need to go a little bit further before we get to that answer. So once again, the second question, we're putting it on hold, and the text is going to answer it in just a minute. But let's go to verse 50 first. It says, Jesus answered and said to him, because I say to you that I saw you under a fig tree, do you believe? You'll see greater things than these. Now remember, it's not just Nathanael that's here. There are other people around. So Jesus says, is that it? He considers that speech, those words, that sign to be a small sign. And yet, Nathanael's belief is great. He turns from skepticism to, you're the King, you're the Son of God. He went from, can anything good come out of Nazareth, to the King of Israel. And Jesus speaks of greater signs to come. And this specifically says, and places Nathanael in Jesus' future. He's saying, Nathanael, you will see greater things. So there's a future there, and there's a promise there. And we, just like Nathanael, as a disciple, we're waiting for it. We're anxious. We're anticipating, okay, what are those signs going to be? We want to see them as well. And we're going to look for them as we go through the book of signs, chapter 2 through 12 in the Gospel of John. And then the final verse, verse 51, and he, Jesus, said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see the heavens open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Now, when he says truly, truly, in Greek, it's literally amen, amen, which you probably know is a Hebrew word, which basically has the idea of confirmation. It's something that people say, and it's used to indicate that you agree with the words that were just uttered. And it's interesting, Jesus is really the first person to coin this, truly, truly, I say to you. There's no evidence of outside of Jesus' words of people saying this. But it was a way of bringing truth to what he's about to say. Something that might be hard to believe, but nonetheless is true. And he says, truly, truly, I say to you. Now, notice it says, Jesus said to him, singular, Nathanael, truly, truly, I say to you, plural. In Greek, that you is plural. So it's not just a testimony that Nathanael will see this, but every one of them, his disciples that are with him, will see this. And what are they going to see? The heavens opened. Now, when it talks about heaven opening, it's where earth can see the light from God. Anything that's coming down from heaven is going to be glorious, have the glory of God, the reflection, the character of God. And here we see angels who are messengers going up and down, ascending and descending. And thus what that image is communicating is a perfect fellowship and communication between Jesus and God. So where Jesus is becoming the mediator between God and humanity. That's the answer to our two questions. Let's go back to our two questions. And the first one is, how did Jesus know what kind of character Nathanael had? Well, he received a message from God. God revealed it to him. We know that Jesus, when he became man, he gave up the independent use of his divine attributes. We know that because there are certain places where he says, no man knows the day or the hour, not even the Son of Man, only the Father knows. So it was what the Father revealed to him, he shared in his words. So when he talks about Nathanael, it's because the Father revealed it to him, gave that message from heaven. And then when we ask how Jesus saw Nathanael, knew Nathanael underneath a fig tree while he was praying or thinking about the coming Messiah, God told him. God revealed that to him and revealed that that was the man that you were supposed to take and choose as your disciple. So Jesus was a man to whom God revealed things from heaven, had a perfect communication, perfect fellowship with the Father. And therefore, Jesus will do the works of God on earth. And that will be directed by the power of heaven. And when Jesus says, you will see, you all will see, what does that tell us about the future of those whom he's speaking with? That they also will be given this evidence. They will have future lives with Jesus. Now, presumably, it's Nathanael, Philip, Andrew, Peter, and most likely also John, who are there. And he's saying, you all are going to see this. You're going to see me do the works of God, communicate the messages from heaven, and be a direct spokesman for God, and ultimately reveal that he himself is God. And Jesus promises that they will see greater signs, greater evidence of who he is, which will in turn require greater amounts of belief and greater faith. As we know more about God, we are also expected and required to have greater faith and adjust our lives to his person and his character. Now, this image of the angels ascending and descending, it harkens back to Jacob again in the Old Testament, where he is fleeing because of a deceit, and God visits him in Bethel while he was fleeing. And we read in Genesis 28:12 that he, Jacob, had a dream, and behold, the ladder was set on earth with its top reaching to heaven. Behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above and said. So that same idea there in Jacob's dream of angels and earth were the intermediaries between heaven and earth, ascending and descending with God's messages and reporting back to God. Here we see it slightly different. Because here it's not just coming to earth, the angels are going directly to Jesus. It tells us that God is communicating directly through Jesus. And it goes right along with the prophecy from Deuteronomy, which is that I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak to them whenever I command. So once again, it's all directing that Jesus is God, God's perfect messenger, has perfect communication and messages from heaven. Okay, and finally, did you notice at the end there it says, and the angels of God will ascend and descend on the Son of Man. Here Jesus is identifying himself as the Son of Man. Now, in Aramaic, this is Barnashah, and those who are hearing him in the historical context, that's a way of saying the angels will descend and ascend on this guy. It's just it's a regular form of saying me. Or, the person standing in your midst is going to do this. It's just a figurative way of saying me. But it also refers to a divine figure from Daniel 7:13 through 14, where the Ancient of Days grants authority in a glorious, everlasting kingdom to the Son of Man, giving him a worldwide kingdom. And so, post-resurrection, reading back, again, we see Jesus' words in a greater way. We see that he's saying, you're going to see the angels ascend and descend on the Son of Man, the divine, authoritative figure in whom God has given an everlasting worldwide kingdom of glory. So the section closes with Jesus' first disciples. And in this section we covered today, it was Philip and Nathanael. And you may have noticed that the stories here, they're a little bit different than what we find in the Synoptic Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the question we may have is, how does the stories we heard today, how do they correspond to the callings of the disciples in those Gospels? The calling of the disciples in the Synoptics, we have Peter and Andrew, and then John and James. Peter and Andrew, they're fishing. And Jesus walks by the Sea of Galilee. He sees them casting their nets, and presumably they're unsuccessful. And Jesus was followed by a crowd, and he was teaching the crowd. And there was 2 boats there, and he boarded a boat, and that was actually Simon's boat. And they pushed off. He asked Simon to push off and to get away from the crowd a little bit, and he taught them. And he taught them for a long period of time. And then when he was done, he told Simon, go out a little further into the sea and cast your net. And Luke tells us that he was unsuccessful before, but because he was a rabbi and he was being respectful, he did it. And then that was that great catch of fish. That's only recorded in Luke 5. And it was so much so that nets were starting to break, and he called for his partners, who were John and James, to come, and they filled both boats with fish. And then they brought him to shore. Then Jesus said to Andrew and Peter, come follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. And they left everything. The biggest catch of their lives, and they leave it. And why did they leave it? Because they knew who Jesus was from John the Baptist's testimony and them meeting Jesus. And at that point, that's when Jesus said, okay, I want you to come follow me as disciples. And then, after he said that, he walked down to where John and James put their boat ashore and said, follow me. And they left their nets, everything, and their father. Now, have you ever wondered, they left their father? So here's the Zebedee. He just lost 4 hired hands, 4 of the greatest fishermen. He just lost them. He also just gained 2 huge boats filled with fish. He was fine for years to come. You could see God compensated. God covered it. And the way that works is that the stories we learned today, that happened first. In our narrative, technically only Philip was called. And we see Andrew, Peter, James, and John being called on this day. And in between, what changed from this time to this time is that John the Baptist was arrested. And that's where Jesus said he began his ministry. And then outside of these disciples, Nathanael, Philip, Andrew, Peter, James, and John, the only calling that we have recorded is Matthew and Levi. And that's recorded a little bit later in Matthew, Mark, and Luke when he's in his tax office. We don't know when Jesus called Judas Iscariot, when he called Thomas, when he called James, the son of Alphaeus. Now it's interesting, son of Alphaeus, it very well could be Matthew's brother, because Matthew is Levi, the son of Alphaeus. So it may be his brother, and it may be that Matthew went and shared with his brother, introduced him to Jesus. We just don't know. There's also Simon the Zealot, and then there's also Thaddeus, who is known as Judas, the son of James. We don't know when they were called, but they were called shortly after. And Matthew, by the way, was called in the tax office in Capernaum near the shore. So once again, pretty close. So that concludes for the first disciples. And so I want to move now to applications just to reiterate the points and make sure we end with what's most important for us to take away with us. Okay, number one, as disciples, Jesus calls us to follow him, to enter into a relationship of learning from him and to continuing his ministry on earth. And does this describe our lives? That is inherent to being a Christian, a follower of Christ. Number two, in these first disciples, we see examples of sharing with others, inviting people to meet Jesus. He is what we were looking for, and he is what they are looking for, whether they know it or not. The kind thing to do is to share and to invite them to investigate for themselves. Whether they do or not is not your responsibility. That's there. All you can do is introduce and share and invite. This week, seek out someone to share Jesus with this week and pray that God would give you an opportunity to do so, that will bring people into your path that may need to know Jesus.